everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our How to Classify Who is a Critical Vendor webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We'll send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session concludes. If you meet all requirements, we'll send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Christine Kitamura, VinMinder's Senior Content Manager of Education. She will discuss the basics of how to identify your critical vendors and some tips on how to manage them effectively. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our Who is a Critical Vendor infographic, our Types of Third-Party Vendor Risk ebook, Critical Risk Vendors, What Should You Be Reviewing infographic, as well as a link to a library of additional resources, all in the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Christine. The floor is yours.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for this webinar about classifying your critical vendors. This is one of those essential third-party risk management skills that once you know how to do it, you'll find that many of your other activities will go a lot more smoothly. So before we begin, I want to take a moment and review the agenda. I'll start off by explaining the importance of criticality and how this concept supports other areas in your third-party risk management program. I'm also going to explain what business impact risk is and some of the key differences between a vendor's criticality and risk rating. We'll also learn some simple questions that you can use to determine a vendor's criticality and some tips to manage those critical vendors. And I'm going to end today's session with a sample vendor list where you can see the reasoning behind why certain vendors would be considered critical. Here are some key reasons why this concept of vendor criticality is so important to have in your third-party risk management program. First of all, it supports regulatory compliance. In many third-party risk management regulations, you'll notice that some variation of critical is usually mentioned multiple times. You might not always see the term critical vendor, but you'll come across similar terms like material or essential or significant. And by using this language, it's clear that regulators expect organizations to focus on these types of vendors that have a critical impact on their operations. Operational resilience is another key area that's heavily dependent on vendor criticality. If you think about your organization's overall ability to continue operations during and after disruptions, chances are that at least some of your vendors play an essential role in supporting that resilience. And finally, business continuity planning, which refers to that specific strategy of making sure you can deliver your products and services during a disruption. These critical vendors should be included in your organization's business continuity plan, and it's also important to review your vendors' plans to make sure they're prepared for disruptions. Now that you understand the importance of criticality, let's review what a critical vendor actually is. A very simple definition would be a vendor that performs a significant business function and could seriously impact an organization if it failed. And when you think of a vendor failure, this could apply to several situations, such as a defective product, a service outage, or even a vendor that had to suddenly shut down its operations because of something like bankruptcy or a consent order. So operational impact is usually the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about criticality, but it's also important to think about some other types of impacts that can happen because of that vendor failure. For example, a vendor failure can have a significant impact on customer satisfaction and retention. There might also be high costs involved to acquire new customers. Other failures by critical vendors could interrupt a material revenue stream or result in large fines or legal settlements. A good example would be a vendor that's used to meet regulatory compliance, such as documentation and reporting. If that vendor isn't producing accurate reports for your organization, you would be held accountable for noncompliance and potential fines. And also think about vendors that provide highly specialized products or services, so there's no alternative in the market, or the onboarding time for a replacement is especially long and causes delays in your operations. Because of those significant impacts, identifying and documenting your critical vendors is a really important activity in your third-party risk management program. And these vendors should even be prioritized by senior leadership and the board, meaning that they know who they are and they understand their impact to your organization. I just want to review some of those reasons why it's important to identify your critical vendors. As I mentioned earlier, these are usually the vendors that regulators will focus on, and they should be included in your business continuity plan. Critical vendors should also undergo the highest level of due diligence and ongoing monitoring. So once you've identified them, these activities will be more efficient because you'll know where to focus your time and effort. Your contracts with critical vendors are also going to require more attention to ensure that they include specific terms and conditions. And your organization should also be establishing exit plans with these vendors so you can terminate the relationship safely. So maybe you've realized that your organization doesn't identify its critical vendors. And if that's the case, I would really encourage you to start developing a process now with the information you learned today. And as you begin creating that process, keep these 3 points in mind. First, just recognize that it's going to be challenging to establish those standards for identifying your critical vendors, especially if there's other stakeholders involved that think about criticality differently. Second, that criteria does need to be agreed upon across your organization and formally documented in your policy. And finally, this criteria should be used for all vendors regardless of the product or service type. This will help make sure that different stakeholders are not interpreting your definition of criticality in different ways. One point I want to emphasize is that the term critical is not a risk rating, which is probably one of the biggest misconceptions about criticality. The concept of criticality identifies the impact on your operations and is binary rather than rated on a scale. On the other hand, a risk rating is something that tells you the types and amounts of risk that are present in the vendor relationship. So you might be looking at cybersecurity risk, financial risk, reputational risk, and so on. These risks are important, of course, but they don't necessarily always have a significant impact on your operations. And this is measured on a scale, which is usually low, moderate, or high. Separating these two concepts will help you understand which vendors are actually essential to your operations and require the most oversight. Although critical is not a risk rating, I do want to explain how it reflects or represents something known as business impact risk. This is the potential threat if the critical vendor fails or goes out of business. The 3 examples shown here describe different types of business impacts. First would be the impact to your customers, such as a customer service call center shutting down after a natural disaster. The second example is an impact to your employees, like your payroll provider that was hit by a ransomware attack and can't process payroll. And the third is the impact to your operations, which could be your customer relationship management platform that files for bankruptcy and shuts down, so you no longer have access to all of those records. Each of these is generally considered a significant business area, which means that the vendors providing those products and services would be critical. You'll also want to include critical vendors in your business impact analysis, which is that process of identifying and evaluating the risks of a business interruption and the likelihood of that interruption occurring. Now I'd like to give a few examples of regulatory perspectives on criticality, and all of these are actual excerpts from the regulations, so you can see the type of wording that's used. In the interagency guidance, which describes the entire third-party risk management lifecycle, you'll notice that the agencies use terms like high-risk activities and critical activities in multiple areas. In the onboarding stage with planning and due diligence and contracting, the guidance states that critical activities should receive extra attention. The NCUA's guidance is very direct and states that credit unions should consider criticality in their risk assessment process. And DORA, which is focused on operational resilience, states that organizations should assess whether a third-party arrangement is critical or important. So it's clear that criticality is an important principle across multiple industries, not just financial institutions. And before I move on, it's time for our first poll question.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, which statement best describes your organization's process for identifying critical vendors? We refer to our policy that describes the criteria for criticality. Senior management classifies each vendor during onboarding. We automatically classify high-risk vendors as critical. Critical vendors are identified through a business impact analysis, other or not sure. Christine, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience.
Sure.
And that question is there any difference between using the term critical instead of other terms such as material, essential, or important?
I would say no. It's really just a matter of preference. I have seen different organizations use each of those terms when referring to a critical vendor, and even different regulators will sometimes use more than one of these words in their guidance. I think the interagency guidance uses terms like critical activities and material issues, which are essentially referring to that same concept of a vendor that can have a significant impact on your operations. But I do want to emphasize that it's really important to be consistent when using these words in your organization. So if you're using the word material as a label for your critical vendors, you might want to consider maybe adding that as an official term in your policy document and making sure you're using it consistently in your procedure documents and even your regular communications. This can just help avoid any misunderstandings that might occur if some people are using the term material and others are using important, which doesn't always have that same intensity attached to it. And just one last point, whichever term you're using, I think it's equally important to avoid using words like less or more, such as saying this vendor is less material, because that's going to imply that there's different levels of criticality. And remember that this should really be a classification that just has two options. So a vendor should either be classified as material or non-material, critical or non-critical, and so on.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, in the related content widget, you can find our Who is a Critical Vendor infographic available for download. Back to you, Christine.
Now, I know there might still be some confusion over criticality and risk ratings, so I hope this slide can help clarify the difference. Criticality is looking at the impact on your operations if a key vendor fails or if you lose access to their product or service. All of your vendors should receive a classification of critical or non-critical, And the loss of a critical vendor means that your organization cannot function as it normally would. A risk rating is the measurement of inherent risk within the vendor relationship, which is usually low, moderate, or high. And the loss of a high-risk vendor can be inconvenient and might create issues around areas like compliance or data security, but you can still function normally and serve your customers. And all of your third parties should have both a risk rating and a criticality classification. I've already talked about why we need to identify critical vendors, but I also want to talk more holistically about why the inherent risk and criticality assessment is so important. This activity is one of the first steps of the third-party risk management lifecycle and is performed internally by your organization. So before you engage with a vendor at all, you're taking an objective look at the inherent risk and criticality of the relationship. The inherent risk and criticality will help you determine the scope of due diligence and which terms and conditions are required in the contract. Your ongoing monitoring activities like risk reassessment, risk and performance monitoring, and periodic due diligence are also based off the inherent risk level and criticality. And the assessment will also identify those vendors that need to have an exit strategy and plan, which typically isn't required for your lower risk and non-critical vendors. Before I get into establishing criticality, I want to quickly review some guidelines on establishing levels of risk. Some organizations might also refer to this as a tiering system. As a best practice, we recommend a simple 3-level approach. However, I'm sure some of you watching today might use a few more levels. Some people will use 5 levels by adding in moderate, high, and low, moderate ratings because 3 levels can seem a little too simplistic. If your organization feels the need to add more risk levels, I think it's important to consider some of the following ideas. First, think about whether those due diligence and ongoing monitoring requirements will change between the different risk levels. If you're using moderate and moderate high, think about the documentation you need to collect for each level. If there isn't much difference, you might want to reconsider using those additional risk ratings. That's just going to add additional time and effort to your process, which might not seem like a lot at first, but it can quickly add up. Second, a tiering methodology should be objective to the point where you can automate it. And that's going to be quite a bit easier with only 3 levels versus 5 or more. And finally, it's important to validate your risk tiering methodology to make sure that anyone using it will get the same risk rating as a result. And the more levels you have, the more likely that you'll get inconsistent. Now, in order to understand this concept of establishing criticality, it helps to think of this car analogy. So imagine that you need to drive 10 miles and ask yourself, what systems and components must be operational to get myself down the road? The basic components that make a car operational would include the engine, wheels, brakes, and the steering and fuel systems. If your car was missing any of these items, the car wouldn't get you from point A to point B. Now think of those other components like the mirrors, windshield wipers, headlights, and even the windows and doors. These items can make the car much more functional and safe to drive, but you can still technically operate your vehicle without them. In this analogy, those basic components like the engine, wheels, and fuel would be considered critical because your car cannot move to its destination without them. Those other components like the windows and doors might be considered high risk but non-critical because they're not essential for the car to operate. Driving without windows and doors would definitely be uncomfortable and pretty unsafe, but if you put that key in the ignition and press the gas, the car is still going to move forward. And most of your vendors are going to be similar to those other non-critical components. Although they're important and serve a specific function to make your business run more smoothly, you can still operate without them for a while. Here are a few more situations in which a vendor could be considered critical. A critical vendor could cause your organization to see significant risk if it failed to meet expectations. And this could apply to something like a 24/7 call center that you have for your customers. If that call center wasn't actually operational 24/7 or provided really poor service, that's going to impact customer satisfaction, which could then affect your reputation and revenue. A critical vendor could also have significant customer impacts. like that call center, or even a third party that's developing and managing a mobile app that customers use. It can also be a critical vendor when your organization has to invest a lot of resources to implement the product or service or manage the risk. And this can happen if the vendor is providing a highly customized product that's integrated into your system, which maybe had to go through extensive testing and implementation. And finally, a vendor could be considered critical if it causes a major impact on your operations, if you have to find an alternate or bring the outsourced activity in-house. Okay, here are 3 fundamental questions that you can use to determine criticality. Number 1, would a sudden loss of this third party cause a significant disruption to our business? That term significant disruption is something that your organization would need to define for itself, but in general, you should be thinking about a disruption that prevents your organization from operating normally. Number 2, would the sudden loss impact our customers? So focusing on our customers, if one of your vendors suddenly shut down its operations today, think about whether that would affect your customers. And number 3, if the service is disrupted, would there be a negative impact to our operations if the time to restore exceeded 24 hours? Now, this question is a little more complex, but should be easier to answer the more you ask it. So think about one of your vendors that you consider critical. If you lost access to that vendor's product or service for more than 24 hours, think about whether that would genuinely cause a negative impact to your operations. If not, maybe that vendor isn't really critical. In general, answering yes to one or more of these questions means that your vendor is critical. Those 3 questions are typically used as a baseline to determine criticality, but you might also want to consider some additional criteria. If your organization is in a highly regulated industry, it's recommended to apply those guidelines and requirements to your criticality classification. First, you can ask if there are significant financial investments or resources to implement the third-party relationship and manage the risk. So if that third party failed and you don't have the time or money to implement that relationship again, that's probably a critical vendor. You can also ask about the material impact to your operations if you had to engage an alternate third party or bring that outsourced activity in-house. You can consider whether a vendor failure could negatively impact your reputation and brand. And maybe you also want to ask about whether the vendor failure could result in enforcement actions or regulatory scrutiny. The questions you ask are entirely your organization's choice, but I would recommend starting with those 3 fundamental questions and then building on from there, just so you don't end up with an extensive list of questions. Here are just a few quick examples of critical vendors that might be familiar to you. A core processing system for online banking would be critical because an organization is depending on that system to be available, and any disruption or outage could significantly impact their operations and customers. Payment systems, data centers, call centers, and even the U.S. Post Office can also be considered critical if an organization depends on them to maintain their operations. But remember that critical vendors aren't limited to those that can affect your business availability. You should also think about vendors that can have a significant impact in areas like regulatory compliance, because in severe situations, that vendor's actions could result in your organization losing its right to conduct business. And just to give you a better idea of other critical vendor types, here are some examples you might see in different industries. In financial services, critical vendors are usually going to be those core processing systems, data centers, compliance management providers, and any vendors involved in security and safety. In healthcare, third parties that provide EHR, medication management, backup power generation, and telehealth would be considered critical. If any of those systems were to go down, that facility cannot care for its patients as it normally would, or at all. In recent years, there's actually been incidents where a third-party data breach impacted the healthcare industry and caused patients to be directed to other hospitals, or they weren't able to receive the care they needed. So obviously, those third parties would be considered critical. In retail, you have things like payment and inventory systems. For manufacturing, critical vendors would be core suppliers. And in higher ed, those ERP systems and intranet systems are generally critical. So as you're going through your process of identifying critical vendors, it's important to keep these three things in mind. First, don't confuse critical with high risk. And I know I've mentioned this several times already, but I really just want everyone to remember that critical vendors are those that have a significant impact on your business and could prevent your organization from operating. And high-risk vendors are those that have high levels of risk in their product or service, but don't necessarily prevent your organization from functioning. Second, many of your critical vendors will also be high risk. Those inherent risk factors used when rating a vendor are often aligned with the criteria for classifying critical. And finally, not all high-risk vendors are going to be critical. Your high-risk vendors are definitely important and have a lot of value, but that doesn't automatically mean that they're critical to your organization. One type of critical vendor that's worth highlighting is one that has no possible replacement, otherwise known as a single point of failure. For example, a vendor that provides a highly specialized software solution could be a single point of failure if no other vendor in the marketplace can provide a similar solution. These vendors must be reported to senior leadership and the board, and it's a best practice to document a formal risk acceptance for these types of vendors. That acceptance should determine whether an alternate vendor should be pursued. So maybe you decide against using the single point of failure and find a different type of solution for your organization's needs. You should also document the potential impacts and the rationale if you do decide to pursue the single point of failure vendor. As with many other third-party risk management activities, you're probably going to face some challenges with establishing your criteria for criticality and your risk ratings. One common challenge is that everyone considers their vendor critical. When you're working with stakeholders across different departments, it's understandable that this issue will come up because a vendor might be really important for their business function, but it's not critical to the organization as a whole. Another challenge is when stakeholders are using their best judgment instead of objective criteria to classify vendors. Risk ratings can be incorrectly calibrated where you have a critical vendor that's rated low risk, or you can have too many levels of risk like low and low moderate, but there's no real benefit for these additional ratings. And even if you do agree and formalize the criteria for criticality, vendor owners might not always understand why critical vendors require the highest level of oversight. So just by thinking about these challenges early on can help you decide on some practical solutions, whether that's taking the time to educate your vendor owners or collaborating with them to set criteria that they understand more clearly. In the next section, I'll be discussing how to manage critical vendors, but first we have another poll question.
Our second poll question of the day is, what is your organization's biggest challenge when rating vendors or classifying criticality? Inconsistency, each vendor is rated or classified using different standards. Ambiguity, risk ratings and criticality aren't used in a meaningful way. Inaccuracy, vendors aren't treated or classified correctly during the initial risk assessment. Other or not sure. Christina, I have another question here that we could go ahead and answer.
Great.
Do any regulations give a clear definition of criticality, or is that something we need to define for ourselves?
Well, there are quite a few regulations that give definitions for terms like critical functions and critical operations, but I personally don't think that they're always very clear because they're often using similar terms like material in the description without giving actual meaning to that word. I know that DORA, the EU regulation for operational resilience, has a definition for critical functions, and the interagency guidance references a separate publication for their definition. But in general, these regulations are still going to require some interpretation when it comes to how they're defining criticality. They're not going to give you that strict criteria that says a vendor is critical if it impacts your organization or customers in the following specific ways. And this is why it helps to have a simple framework like those 3 yes or no questions, because there's less of a chance that you're going to misinterpret any of those questions. But overall, I wouldn't overthink these definitions from all of these regulations, as long as your organization has a clear and documented process for identifying its critical vendors. And of course, it's important to read and understand the regulations that apply to you, but there's always going to be some level of interpretation for a lot of these concepts that are going to look slightly different for every organization. So if you're using your criticality criteria consistently and can defend your reasoning, that's usually what regulators are looking for. So I hope that helps.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our Types of Third-Party Vendor Risk ebook available for download in the Related Content widget. This is a helpful resource that discusses the different types of vendor risk in more detail with examples. Christine, back to you.
Okay, now that I've talked quite a bit about critical vendors and how to identify them, let's move on to some practical steps for managing these critical vendors. And this begins with planning for the relationship during the onboarding stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle. So your first step is selecting a vendor owner that has the qualifications and skills to manage a critical vendor, which means they're educated in third-party risk management and understand the impact that these types of vendors can have on your organization. Planning should also involve determining if the vendor is a single point of failure and identifying an exit strategy and plan. So you know right from the start whether you'll be using an alternate vendor or bringing the activity in-house or discontinuing the activity altogether. You should also be identifying your service level agreements and performance metrics to be used in the vendor engagement. From there, you can proceed with your inherent risk assessment and due diligence, which should be very thorough because you really want to obtain as much relevant information as possible on a vendor that can impact your organization in such a significant way. An issue remediation plan might also need to be considered for your critical vendors, so you know the steps to take if that vendor's performance starts declining or if there's some other problem that needs to be addressed. And also make sure to track due diligence expiration dates so you can request new versions and review them as needed. For contracting, you'll want to make sure that a critical vendor contract has essential provisions for things like data protection, compliance, and a right to audit. And it's also important to schedule a midterm contract review so you have plenty of time to renegotiate and make any necessary changes. Some other activities involve establishing monitoring routines, such as periodic risk reassessments and due diligence, both of which should be done at least annually. Performance monitoring should be ongoing, with formal reviews done at least once a quarter. You should also determine which methods you'll use to monitor your critical vendors, either by using risk alert and monitoring services or negative news alerts, or really anything else that your organization finds effective. And an annual review of the exit strategy and plan is really important to make sure that it's still viable in case you need to exit the relationship. But in addition to all of these activities, you should be keeping senior management and the board informed of these critical vendors throughout the relationship. This means keeping a list of your critical vendors and informing the board of any single points of failure. Any issues with your critical vendors should also be reported regularly, along with the status updates so they know when these issues are still open or closed. And those performance reports should also be presented to senior management and the board at least annually. Ongoing monitoring is usually one of those third-party risk management activities that isn't always prioritized as it should be, so I want to provide some best practices to use with your critical vendors. The first tip is to perform deeper due diligence that's based on your organization's policy, although you may need additional information on a case-by-case situation. So don't just assume that you need to stick with your standard due diligence expectations when it comes to your critical vendors. For example, you might be assessing a new vendor and determine that you need to complete a performance assessment or an on-site visit which maybe isn't a standard expectation in your policy. You might also determine the need for certain insurance coverage to make sure that the vendor covers any material impacts caused by a disruption or a breach. Fourth parties is another important factor with your critical vendors. Now, this is a really extensive topic, but the key point to remember is that you should be aware of your critical vendors' fourth parties that are contributing to the product or service that your organization is using. So if your critical vendor uses a cloud service provider to handle your organization's data, you should know who that provider is and what they have access to. Some other best practices for monitoring your critical vendors includes having that exit strategy, which is something that you should establish during onboarding, but you still need to think about this throughout the entire vendor engagement. A critical vendor relationship can end very abruptly, so it's essential to always be mindful of your exit strategy to make sure that you're prepared to either switch to another vendor, bring that outsourced product or service in-house, or just continue that outsourced activity. Reviewing the vendor's business continuity plan is something that should be done during initial due diligence, but also after you sign the contract during those annual reviews. This helps give that assurance that the vendor's plan is still effective and being tested regularly. Contract standards is another important practice, which includes that language that's specific to the critical vendor relationship, and contracts should also be covered throughout the term to ensure that the vendor is meeting expectations around service level agreements and any other performance standards that you have. And finally, remember to consider using monitoring alert services for your critical vendors, which can notify you of any changes in the vendor's cybersecurity risk, financial health, reputation, and more. And before I continue on with our final section, it's time for our last poll question.
Our third and final poll question is, what do you consider the best strategy to manage critical vendors more effectively in your organization? Formalizing our criticality classification, increasing our ongoing monitoring on critical vendors, including critical vendors in our business continuity planning, developing exit strategy for all critical vendors, other or not sure. Christine, let's answer another question that's come in from the audience.
Okay.
Should we ask our vendors if their other customers consider them critical?
This is a pretty common question we get, and I know it might seem like an easy shortcut to classify a vendor, but I wouldn't recommend doing this because there's always a possibility that your vendor's other customers are using different criteria for criticality, or they just have different operational needs than your organization. They might use critical and high risk interchangeably, which I've seen many people do, and that wouldn't tell you whether this vendor is actually essential to their operation. So for example, let's say that you're doing a risk assessment on a vendor that provides data destruction services. This vendor would generally be considered high risk because it has access to your sensitive data, and there's probably some compliance risk associated with their service. And if you were to ask this vendor whether their other customers consider them critical, they could very well say yes, even though the service doesn't meet your criteria for critical. This is a vendor that could probably shut down suddenly, but wouldn't have a significant business impact on your organization because you could still function normally and serve your customers as you looked for a replacement. So criticality is something that should be established by your organization, so you have that consistent process to use without needing to ask your vendor about their other customers.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering that question. I'd quickly like to mention that in the related content widget, you can find our critical risk vendors, what should you be reviewing infographic. As critical vendors require more attention, be sure to check out this resource that discusses what you should be reviewing for those vendor types. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Christine.
All right, for this final section, I'm going to go through a sample vendor list one by one and explain the rationale for why each vendor could be considered critical or non-critical. And this could be a very helpful practice for those of you who don't have much experience in classifying critical vendors. Most of these 9 vendors have a clear yes or no classification, but a few of them are actually going to be maybe or it depends. The first vendor on the list is a payment processor called Easy Payments. So let's say that your business is an online retailer and all of your transactions are processed through this vendor. If you think back to those 3 fundamental questions, you can probably answer yes to each one. A sudden loss of Easy Payments would definitely cause a significant disruption to your business because you wouldn't be able to sell your products. The sudden loss would impact your customers in the sense that they can't purchase your products and would probably start looking at a different site to find what they need. And an extended outage would create a negative impact on your operations because no money coming in means that you can't pay your bills and keep your business running as it normally would. So all this to say, a payment processor would be considered critical because your organization has an operational reliance on this vendor service. The next example on this list is a managed service provider called MSP Solutions. And let's imagine that this vendor is specifically used for a hospital's help desk support. Anytime there's an IT problem with the hospital system for electronic health records or medical imaging, those healthcare workers connect with this vendor who can remotely diagnose and resolve that issue. This vendor would also be considered critical because of the hospital's operational reliance on their services. If the hospital suddenly lost access to this vendor service, they could potentially also lose access to those other systems that are critical for them to provide patient care. Next on the list is Document Express, a statement production facility. And for this example, this vendor is being used by a credit union. Now, this credit union offers electronic statements, but maybe many of its members prefer to receive their statements by mail. So each month, this credit union is relying on Document Express to mail out their members' statements. This is one of those vendor types that doesn't have a clear-cut yes or no criticality classification. On one hand, this vendor could be considered critical if it was the sole provider of the service. If that credit union suddenly lost this vendor maybe 1 week before the next round of statements are due, that might create some difficulties to find an alternate vendor and go through the entire onboarding process. However, maybe this credit union uses more than one vendor for the service, which may be common for a lot of organizations depending on their size and available resources. And in that case, Document Express would not be critical because there's another vendor who could fill that gap. Okay, Credit Score Inc. is a sample credit reporting agency, and this is another vendor that might be critical depending on some different factors. If a financial institution is using credit score as the only agency to make credit decisions, and there would be a lot of time and effort needed to replace this vendor, then yes, they would likely be considered critical. But maybe the organization is using credit score in combination with multiple agencies to make those decisions about a customer's credit. That financial institution could face a situation where Credit Score Inc. suddenly shuts down or experiences an outage, and they could still rely on those other agencies to perform that business function. So in that case, it wouldn't be considered critical. This next example is a good one that shows a high-risk, non-critical vendor. Self-based shredding is a vendor that provides shredding services for all of those sensitive documents and media that a lot of organizations need to dispose of securely. The initial thought about this type of vendor is that it's critical because it has access to all of that sensitive information, and there's compliance and regulatory risks that you have to consider. However, a shredding provider is generally one that's easily replaceable and one that organizations could function without for more than 24 hours. So just consider if this vendor went bankrupt and suddenly could no longer service your organization. That might be inconvenient because you would need to look for a replacement, but that vendor loss doesn't have a significant impact on your customers or operations. Next, we have eco-friendly landscaping, which I hope is an easy one to determine now that we've gone through several sample vendors already. This would likely be considered a low-risk, non-critical vendor because they don't have an impact on your operations, customers, or employees. They don't have access to any sensitive information, they don't perform an essential business function, and they're easily replaceable. If you lost this vendor tomorrow, chances are that you could find a replacement in probably just a few days. Now let's talk about circle property management, which is a landlord. In a lot of cases, a landlord wouldn't be considered critical because an organization can typically still operate as usual, even if the landlord goes bankrupt or suddenly shuts down. There might be legal protections in place in which that landlord's failure wouldn't necessarily have an impact on your operations. However, a landlord might be considered critical if they're responsible for certain systems that can impact your organization, especially if you're working in a highly regulated industry. So imagine if your landlord is responsible for things like decontamination or maintaining clean rooms and data center security. These might be areas in which your organization is highly regulated and could potentially be the cause of your operations shutting down because your landlord isn't meeting regulatory standards. So in that case, a landlord would be considered critical. Moving on to the final two samples on our list, Vault Data Management is an offsite document storage vendor, which, similar to the landscaper, would be non-critical because they're usually easy to replace. Of course, you would need to consider the compliance risk with these vendors, since a lot of industries have requirements around how long to retain documents and maybe security considerations, but you can probably find another document storage provider very easily in the marketplace, and you wouldn't need to invest a lot of time and effort to make that switch. Okay, our final sample is going to be Secure Cloud Services, a cloud provider. There's, of course, many different cloud providers out there that are used in various ways depending on the industry, and for the most part, these will be considered critical. For this example, let's say that Secure Cloud Services is used by a financial institution to manage all of their customer data. This would classify the vendor as critical for two reasons. First, because of that operational reliance. If Secure Cloud Services shut down its platform for more than 24 hours, that financial institution doesn't have access to its customers' data, which means they can't operate as they normally do. And second, this vendor's failure could have a significant impact on the organization's data security, which could lead to many other impacts like regulatory fines, legal fees, and severe reputational damage. This vendor might also be difficult or at least very costly to replace because of how much data they're handling and the time it would take to onboard a new vendor and integrate them into your system. As we wrap up today's session, I just want to review some key takeaways that I think are really important to remember. First is that your critical vendors are the ones that would have a significant impact on your organization or customers if they failed. Criticality is separate from risk rating, but a vendor should be assigned both. So you might have a critical high-risk vendor or a non-critical moderate risk vendor. If you're not too experienced with classifying criticality, you can start off by asking those three fundamental questions. And remember, those were about the sudden loss of the vendor, its impact on your customers, and whether an extended outage would impact your operations. Managing critical vendors effectively involves thorough due diligence, careful contract drafting, and ongoing monitoring at the highest oversight level. Your critical vendors are usually going to be in scope for your audits and regulatory exams, and senior management and the board should always be informed of your critical vendor activities, contract renewals, those single point of failure vendors, and any issues that you have with your critical vendors. Risk reassessments and due diligence should be done at least annually, and formal performance reviews should be done at least quarterly. And finally, that exit strategy should be established during onboarding and should be reviewed each year just to ensure it's still viable in case you need to leave the vendor relationship. I just want to thank you for joining us today, and I know there's a lot of information to take in from today's session, but I hope that you've gained a better understanding of what critical vendors are and how they can impact your organization. This can help you identify your own critical vendors and manage them more effectively within your third-party risk management program.
Great, thanks so much, Christine. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Christine for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On October 1st through 3rd, our third-party risk management bootcamp, and on October 15th, Staffing Your Third-Party Risk Management Program webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Christine, our next question is there a baseline percentage for how many of your vendors are critical, such as industry data shows 1 to 3% of all vendors are critical?
We usually see about 15% as the average for many organizations across different industries. But if you find that you have a much larger percentage, that's a good sign that you need to review your criteria and confirm that these vendors are actually critical. It's possible that your organization has combined critical and high risk, so it's worth taking the time to reestablish that criteria and go through your vendor inventory to make sure that you've identified those third parties that can have a severe impact on your operations or customers. But I would say the most important thing is to just correctly identify your critical vendors instead of focusing too much on whether your percentage is lower or higher than average.
Great. Next question. Can a criticality classification ever change like a risk rating can?
Typically, no. If you determine that a vendor is critical and therefore essential to your operations, there wouldn't be many situations where you would lose that dependency on the vendor. If that were to happen, I think that would indicate that there's some other significant change within your organization, like maybe the removal of a core business activity. The only other situation I can think of might be one of those sample vendors where the classification was maybe or it depends. For example, I listed a vendor that could be considered critical if it was the sole provider of that service. So maybe your organization initially onboards just one vendor for a critical service, but then a few years later onboards one or two others, so you're no longer solely dependent on that original vendor. And if you were to change that criticality classification, that would need to be formally documented with your reasoning of why it's no longer critical. However, keep in mind that many of your critical vendors are also going to be high risk, which means that they still require a lot of oversight. Those risk reassessments and due diligence reviews should be done at least once a year for those high-risk vendors, and risk and performance monitoring should be done more frequently than what you would do otherwise for lower risk vendors. And just a final quick note, those inherent risk ratings shouldn't really be changing either, because this is the untreated risk that occurs naturally in the vendor relationship without any consideration to mitigating controls. You might have a vendor with a high inherent risk rating that's lowered to moderate residual risk after due diligence, but all of your oversight activities should still be based on that high risk rating.
Great. Next question. Since criticality overlaps with operational risk, can we use that risk rating to classify the vendor? For example, any vendor that's rated high risk and operational risk is automatically considered critical?
That's a fair question, but I would still recommend keeping your processes for criticality and risk rating separate. If you start blurring the lines between those two concepts or focusing more on that risk rating, I think there's a possibility that criticality can become less significant or lose its meaning. And although operational disruptions are a major element of criticality, you also have to consider the vendor's impact to your customers and employees. A critical vendor could also require a significant investment in resources to implement that relationship, which might not always be evident in your assessment for operational risk. If there is a lot of operational risk in a vendor engagement, that's usually a good sign that the vendor will also be critical, but you should still take the time to verify it separately. Every vendor should go through that classification process in the same way, just to make sure that you get consistent results. So when you keep criticality separate, it provides a more consistent method and shows auditors and regulators that you know which vendors have a significant impact on your organization.
Right, next question. How often should we assess our non-critical vendors to confirm that the classification hasn't changed?
I would recommend following the general cadence for risk reassessment, which is based on criticality and risk ratings. So for your non-critical vendors that are high risk, you can reassess for criticality at least annually. And moderate risk vendors can be reassessed every 18 to 24 months. You should also reassess if anything changes with the product or service, or if you purchase a new product from that vendor. Each vendor's product should always be assessed individually, so it is possible that you would need to go through that process multiple times with the same vendor. So let's say that you currently purchase a single non-critical product from one of your vendors, and a year later you decide to purchase another product that's designed specifically for your organization, and therefore there's no alternative in the market. That could mean that the vendor is now critical because of that new product.
Great, next question. Should critical vendors be selected and approved by senior management?
They don't necessarily need to select and approve your critical vendors, but they should be informed of who they are and why they're considered critical. This just confirms that there's oversight at that higher level, so senior management isn't making uninformed decisions that can create severe disruptions. You don't want to create a situation where senior management makes a rash decision about terminating a vendor and then realizing after that they were critical to your operations and you had all these other dependencies on that vendor service. And senior management should also be reviewing performance reports on critical vendors, and they should know about any open issues that you have with these vendors. So if one of your critical vendors is maybe late in submitting a due diligence document, that's something that should be escalated to senior management and continuously reported to them until the issue is closed. And depending on the type of issue and its severity, they could also make decisions about whether to terminate that vendor relationship. And finally, they should also be aware of the exit strategy and exit plans with those vendors so they know exactly what will happen if that vendor is terminated.
And I think we have time for one more quick question. Is it possible to not have any critical vendors?
I would say it's very unlikely to have zero critical vendors. Most organizations are going to be dependent on at least a few vendors for their products and services to maintain their operations. And even if a vendor is providing just a component of something that you need for one of your products or services, that vendor might be considered critical to your operations. If you currently don't have any critical vendors in your inventory, that could be a sign that you need to reevaluate your criteria, or maybe you need to establish it for the first time. So just make sure you involve senior management and other appropriate stakeholders so the criteria is well defined and understood for your program.
Great, thanks, Christine. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Christine, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Christine for her time in sharing some great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to vendor criticality. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.